Okay, hi everybody. This is lecture 9, cell communication. Um, First of all, I have no idea why the visual of me is blurry. I can't fix it. So you could kind of mostly see me. I don't know why it's blurry, and I can't keep taking time to fix it because then I have less time to record. Anyway, okay. So, cell communication. We've talked about parts of the cell, we focus on the cell membrane, and so we kind of come back to some of these ideas of what is part of a cell membrane. If you remember, there's different kinds of membrane proteins. They could be like peripheral proteins, integral proteins. Proteins can do all kinds of things. And so here we're kind of focusing back to that. And then again, to fit something into the bigger picture, organisms need to be able to adapt and do different things to survive. And so their cells have to communicate with each other. Even if we think of cells as kind of just like this boring blob that we learn about, they actually communicate a lot. So, for example, how does cell signaling fuel this flight of an impala running from a cheetah? So something has to happen for all of these responses to happen. So the impala senses a cheetah. Maybe it hears it, maybe it sees it, but it senses a cheetah somehow. And so its brain then signals to the adrenal glands to release epinephrine in the blood. So epinephrine is a hormone that can be released from the brain. It travels through the blood throughout the body and then can go act on different kinds of cells to have different responses. And so that's context for the cell communication lecture that we're going to talk about today. So when epinephrine reaches a receptor for epinephrine, the signal is received, right? Signal reception. It activates a whole pathway of like relay molecules. So kind of like a relay race, in which there's like a team of people. Somebody runs here, passes a baton, and then they run here, pass the baton, and then they run here. So it's kind of like a relay, but instead of physically actually transferring one thing to each thing, there's like the message is changed. And so instead of a baton, maybe it's, I don't know, like a snack. I don't know. And so there's a relay of molecules, and then eventually there's a cell response. And so maybe these cells break down the storage molecule of glycogen and get a bunch of glucose, and then the cells have energy to be able to run in this muscle cell in the leg. So that's an example. So, for context, in general, there's been, an evolution of cell communication. So, ancestral signaling molecules probably evolved in prokaryotes. Even super simple organisms, like prokaryotes that we think of as like simple, had to be able to communicate, even way, way back. And so ancestral signaling molecules likely evolved in prokaryotes and single cell eukaryotes, and then got adopted for use in multicellular descendants. And so, yeah, sometimes we think of cells as like being static or not really doing much, but they really do, even prokaryotes. So research in the 1970s suggested that bacterial cells were capable of signaling to each other. So bacteria cells don't just exist on their own, like they can actually signal to each other different kinds of signals. So cell signaling is critical among prokaryotes like bacteria. And so having a concentration of signaling molecules allows bacteria to sense local population density. So these bacterial cells can gauge like how many other bacteria cells are nearby. So for example, say you are in a crowded room, you can physically sense like all these other people up against you. And so that's kind of like what this is. So this is what's called quorum sensing. It allows bacteria to sense local population density. And an example of quorum sensing is the formation of a biofilm. So you might even see these like maybe in the shower. If you have those shower like sliding doors, there can be stuff that builds up at the bottom. And so that is probably a biofilm of bacteria that they like in certain conditions, they'll start like secreting stuff and then they'll multiply. And then so a biofilm is like a bunch of bacterial cells, an aggregation of bacterial cells stuck to a surface. So yeah, that might happen in the shower or other kinds of environments. But yeah, bacteria will sense each other and then they'll kind of like adhere to the surface. Another example of medical importance is secretion of toxins by infectious bacteria. So interfering with the signaling pathways in quorum sensing may be a promising approach as an alternative to antibiotic treatment. So if you're kind of telling each other, if you find a way to disrupt their way to stick to a surface, maybe they won't get to such high numbers. Yeah. So here is a visual example. So here you can kind of see that there are a bunch of individual rod-shaped cells. It's still, from a distance. And then as the cells start aggregating and like multiplying, you see it start to like form more. And then there's more and more and more forming. And then so you see a spore forming structure known as the fruiting body. And then you might even be able to visually see these. And so, for example, another example, in this case, it is eukaryotes because yeast, like Saccharomyces cerevisiae, are small, but they are eukaryotes. And so they have two mating types, these little yeast cells. So again, when you're thinking of like baker's yeast, these are actual organisms. And so they have two mating types, A and alpha. So it's kind of like instead of male and female, there's these two mating types, A and alpha, for these cells. And so cells of different mating types locate each other via secreted factors specific to each type. So it's almost kind of like pheromones for these yeast cells. One of them is A and maybe secretes certain kinds of secreted factors that only A puts out. And then the other one, alpha, has its own kind of secreted factors. And so they can tell and find each other that way. So yeah, kind of like pheromones. And so the binding of a mating factor at the cell surface initiates a series of steps called a signal transduction pathway. And so we'll talk more about, what that is. So that's an example of cell communication as well, as like cells can literally identify each other basically based on what is secreted and what they receive. Yeah. So the molecular details of signal transduction in yeasts and mammals are very similar. So here's an example of those two different kinds of yeast cells, mating types. So this one's A, and then this one's alpha. So this little purple circle is the factor that mating type A puts out, and then it gets received by the mating type alpha, and so it's like, ooh, there's an A nearby, and it also secretes its own alpha factor, and then the type A senses that and is like, ooh, there's an alpha mating type nearby, and then so then they come together and mate. So, I started with these big categories, hierarchies. So cells in a multicellular organism communicate via signaling molecules. And there is local signaling, and then there's also long distance signaling. So in this first part, we'll talk about local signaling. That's why it has the Roman numeral I. And so in local signaling, animals can communicate via a couple different ways. So there is direct contact, and then through signaling molecules. So there are two like sub methods of direct contact. They can either be directly contacted through cell junctions or through cell surface molecules, or signaling molecules. So this is kind of like the overview of the next few slides in this section for local signaling. So we'll go to, again, under direct contact, we'll talk about the first method of direct contact, cell junctions. So cell junctions, I mentioned this at the very, very end, I believe, of the tour of the cell lecture, and now here's where it like comes into context. So some animal and plant cells have cell junctions that directly connect the cytoplasm of these neighboring cells. So these two cells in this figure on the left are animal cells, and then on the right they're plant cells, but there are like physical connections between these two different cells. So it's kind of like there's a little portal or a little tunnel between this cell to this cell. And so their cytoplasms are directly connected. And so like if one cell has a molecule, it can send it right over. And the same for plant cells. So these are different kinds of connections. In animal cells, they're gap junctions. In plant cells, they are plasmodesmata. It's just like a little tunnel between these two cells, and they like directly signal stuff to each other. So the signaling substances in the cytosol can pass directly between adjacent or neighboring cells. The second method of like direct contact local signaling is through cell surface molecules. So they can be close to each other, and then instead of being like physically connected by like a tunnel, it's like this cell surface molecule comes in direct contact with the molecule on this cell's surface. So animal cells can also communicate that way by direct contact between their cell surface molecules. Remember, there's a lot of stuff like sticking out from the cell membrane. And so some of those can literally like touch each other, and then that's how they signal, oh, okay, there's one of these other cells nearby. And so local signaling is especially important in embryonic development, in immune response, and in maintaining adult stem cell populations. And so those both were two methods of direct contact, right? There was, they are either directly connected, cytoplasm to cytoplasm, or directly like touching cell surface molecules. So this is another method of local signaling, but it's through signaling molecules. So in other cases, animal cells secrete messenger molecules that travel short distances. And so this type of local signaling in animals is called paracrine signaling. And so here is a picture. So here's a cell. It's making some kind of protein or something that it wants to send out, and then those signaling molecules can travel short distances to go and talk to nearby cells. So for example, growth factors, say there's like a little zygote and it's getting ready to divide and become an embryo. And so some cells might secrete some stuff called growth factors, and they stimulate nearby target cells to grow and divide. And so those are one class of like local regulators in animals. Another example, which of course is my favorite, is the nervous system. So synaptic signaling happens between neurons, between nerve cells. So in the nervous system, one neuron can make and secrete a neurotransmitter. And so that's what this neuron spits out into this gap that's called a synapse. So it'll secrete this neurotransmitter, and then this target cell will receive it and then, communicate to the next one, or whatever the method for this exact message is. So that's an example of signaling molecules or neurotransmitters. And so drugs used to treat things like depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder affect this signaling process. So for example, there is a class of antidepressants called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And so serotonin is a neurotransmitter that gets secreted. And sometimes one cell will send the serotonin and then communicate something to the next cell. And then some serotonin is taken back in. So it's, there's reuptake. And so those kinds of SSRIs block the reuptake so that there's still some serotonin still hanging out and like working a little bit more because maybe this person, that's what's needed, So yeah, that's an example of signaling molecules, neurotransmitters. And then, so there's also long distance signaling. So long distance signaling is not between neighboring cells or cells that are super close by. You need different kinds of molecules to go longer distances. So for example, with the impala that's running, it's epinephrine, otherwise known as adrenaline, that's coming from the brain and has to go really long distances and talk to the muscle cells and other stuff. And so that in those cases, you need a different kind of molecule, not just like a neurotransmitter. They don't go that far. So in long distance signaling, plants and animals use hormones for long distance signaling. That's kind of repetitive, my bad. So in hormonal or endocrine signaling in animals, specialized cells will make and release hormones, and those can travel to the target cells via the circulatory system. Like they're able to be more stable and travel longer distances. So they'll travel through the circulatory system and then go eventually bind to target cells in the muscle of the legs so that this impala can run. And so the ability of a cell to respond to a signal depends on those cells having a receptor for that signal. So there has to be, again, in this case, epinephrine, there have to be receptors for epinephrine, and that's where that hormone will act. Because hormones will travel throughout the body, you don't want it. It's only going to work on cells and tissues that have receptors for epinephrine specifically, or for other things. The message has to be able to be received for those cells to like do that thing. So I think one example in the Crash Course Biology video for the cell membrane was Wi-Fi. Like Wi-Fi is out here. And in your neighborhood, there's probably all kinds of different like Wi-Fi's that you could join. But it depends on if you have the router and if you have the password, so hormones are going out throughout the body in the circulatory system, but there has to be the right receptor, and password for that Wi-Fi signal and that hormone.